One of the things that we're hearing from so many artists as they approach Bach is how infinitely challenging that music is, that you feel like your work is never done.
It strikes the balance between challenging but also with a purpose.
It's so honest and real, and I think that's part of the challenge of it. That's part of what makes it very difficult to play and very satisfying.
He's not making it difficult to make our lives difficult. It's difficult because he wants to achieve a certain effect. Once we get there, it's so satisfying.
You never feel, oh, I've got it. You never feel that way. It's always something more to discover, something more to think about, something more to treasure. And that, I think, is an arc over a whole lifetime of this music, which is really special and not always the case with every composer, I think.
Hi, my name is Nicholas Pond, and this is the Bach 52 Project. This week's guest is Doctor of Musicology and Vice President of the American Bach Society, Ellen Exner. Ellen and I sat down for a fantastic conversation in December of 2022 when I was in Philadelphia performing with the Philadelphia Orchestra. Ellen and I spoke about questions of canon in the classical music repertoire and Bach's place in it. We also spoke about Bach's music and how it was not popular shortly after he passed and took a while to get back into the revered place in which we hold it today. And we also spoke a little bit about questions of what his intentions were for this music. It was a fascinating conversation, and I hope you enjoy watching the interview. And stick around for the aria at the end from Cantata 121. Christum wir sollen loben schon.
So the thing that I'm really trying to explore and dig into is, in general, this sort of unanswerable question, is the music of Bach for everyone? Obviously, you can go in a lot of different directions from that, but I'm really interested in your musicological perspective, and let's just start pretty basically. You know, how did you get into the music of Bach? How did it enter your life?
Well, I think I came to it the way most people do, through listening and as a musician. My parents had a pretty broad collection of LPs when I was a kid, and my mother and father loved music, and they would put on, we'd have Handel's Water music, and we would have the Bach Brandenburg concertos, and we'd have these things always. And when I became an oboe player, I started getting more and more interested in Baroque repertory, which is just one of the great treats of being an oboist. And eventually you sort of can graduate to playing Bach's music. It's so complicated. It's so rewarding when you get it right. There was a particular draw just to the sound and the experience of playing it for me. And that's how I came to wanting to know more. And eventually that wanting to know more grew into the desire to go to graduate school and to get a PhD. And I was lucky enough to be accepted to Harvard to study with Christoph Wolff, who is, the author of so many wonderful things, including the latest biography on Bach's life and works. Then from there, just having the opportunity to work with him and to go to the Bach archive in Leipzig and work with those guys who were, many of them were Harvard students, a lot were not, but there's sort of a connection, and it becomes a little bit of a family for anybody who is willing to do the hard work to learn the German, to learn to read the old script, to learn to love looking at old manuscripts and figuring out what they mean. It's sort of, so the listening is the gateway drug. And then there's the performing, and there's the curiosity. Doing that work and really digging into the repertoire and continuing to play. These things were all sort of just mutually fueling. And that's how I got to Bach.
I love the way you describe it as a gateway drug. It's funny, a lot of the people I've been speaking to, particularly the instrumentalists, they all talk about there's this physical sensation of playing it that just kind of invites you to want to learn more. And everybody talks about that complexity, but there's something about that complexity that is inviting as opposed to...
I think that the complexity is inviting to a particular kind of challenge-loving person. Sometimes that complexity can be off-putting, and I perfectly well understand that. But there's also something to, if this is your fuel, there's something to really owning that complexity. I remember the first Bach cantata I ever got to play. It's of course on modern instruments, and I play a lot more in Baroque instruments now, but I couldn't believe I had I had that kind of luck to be able to sit and do this. And then somebody offered me money to come and play Bach cantatas. Are you kidding? You'll pay me? I would pay to do this. Every week, I would pay to do this. And that's the kind of, well, you know, it's the kind of experience that it's not replaceable. And it's either you have it or you don't. But really grateful for the people around you who also want to do it, and the people who want to hear it, and the people who want to pay for it, and the people who just want to keep it all going, because there is something so energizing and so special about playing music of this particular caliber, and it tends to draw people who also want to do that. And that takes a pretty high degree of training and discipline and love to pull it off. So maybe that's part of the calculus as well.
It's interesting. I mean, he's lived in a very specific time in a very specific place. You know, in particular with the oboe, he was composing. He's the only person really to compose, or it's the only region that features music for the oboe d'amore, for instance. Like, it's a very specific thing, and yet it's this thing that people from all over the world get drawn to. And I'm just I'm so curious to unpack those layers. And I'm wondering if, in your research, you've come across people you wouldn't expect maybe to, you know, who have been influenced by his music?
I don't know whether I have anything particularly interesting to say about the people who have been influenced by it, apart from other composers, just generations of composers following Bach's example once his works became exemplary for other composers, and there was a long time where that wasn't the case. So there are lots of interesting layers to Bach reception and to thinking about how that thread was relatively thin in the 50 years following his death, not non-existent, but relatively, and then it sort of blossoms in the 19th century with a different set of sort of priorities and a different way of looking at the repertory. That all becomes really a fascinating and complicated and occasionally kind of difficult thing to reckon with. Is Bach for everybody? I don't think there's anything that's man-made that is for everybody. Right? I mean,
Right.
We all need water, we all need love, we all need food. But in terms of what kind of is Bach for everybody, I think Bach is for everybody who wants it. I don't think anyone should ever feel badly or forced to think that they should love something that maybe they don't. If you don't love Bach, that's okay. A lot of people in Bach's time didn't love Bach. A lot of people found his music overly complex and too long, not stylish enough. Fine. I think that anybody who wants Bach should be enabled to overcome the barriers of finance or of culture, to be able to access it, to be able to study it, to be able to learn it. Those things are things that we can help with that. Whether everyone should have Bach, I don't think that's, if they want it, great. If they don't want it, walk away. You know,
Right. Should be a consenting relationship.
It's a consenting relationship. And I think you had mentioned something when we were speaking about having this conversation about repertory and access and all of those kinds of things. And having been a professor at New England Conservatory for a while and having taught at universities for the last decade, there's a lot of thinking right now about what belongs in a curriculum and what belongs in the repertory and, you know, what's it all for. I think that Bach's mastery of counterpoint and the kinds of the genres that he participated in and understanding the legacy for composers and performers of his compositions, that to me is something you can't do away with in a curriculum if you're wanting to be a student of Western art music or notated European tradition or whatever you want to call it, because it's so foundational. And if you want to understand the logic of counterpoint, you want to understand the logic of how 18th century music is put together and then how early 19th century music is put together and how things change. These are the basic sort of literacy building blocks. If that repertory is something that you want to understand in this particular way, then it's indispensable. You don't have to like it, but it's a set of tools for understanding how composers sort of trained, how they think about how compositions are put together, and how they're reflected on a legacy that they were very self-conscious about. Those who studied Bach's music in the 19th century were pretty aware of what was possible contrapuntally, what these works can communicate, and sort of how you can think through a large-scale composition. So I think those building blocks are sort of, I would consider them relatively essential. Are they the only standard? Absolutely not, but they are a standard. And if that's what you want to do, then that's something you should endeavor to hold on to in your teaching and your learning. But that doesn't have to be for everybody. It comes back to who's this for? Whoever wants it.
That's a really wonderful framing. I mean, the thing about art, right, is it's all sort of in dialogue with other art and the world around it. And I mean, Bach's music, it's interesting, this conversation about what should be in canon and what should be sort of in the core curriculum. And, you know, I think you're right, like at the exclusion of everything else, maybe not, but is it necessary that it be there? Of course, because there's such a vast amount of music that is in dialogue with it. And also, I mean, students have the opportunity to be in dialogue with it too. I mean, that's the glorious thing about being a musician. It's a living art form. And so, you know, Bach's manuscripts may look really beautiful on the page, but they don't actually come to life until we interact with it or choose not to interact with it. And it's funny that that's actually a really empowering concept, I think. Yeah, no, thank you for that. That's wonderful. I would love to hear more about sort of that 50 years after, where you said people weren't so interested in Bach, and kind of why and what's problematic about it, what's sort of crunchy about it,
Well, the answer of why people weren't particularly interested in the 50 years after his death is that this music was not fashionable. The style, we have an idea of a canon of timelessness, of masterworks, but anything that's, things need time before they can shed the trappings of what was stylish and what was unfashionable before they become fashionable again, in a way, if that makes sense. So liturgy changed in Bach's time. The function of music in services changed. The musical styles simply changed, and this stuff was old-fashioned even in its own time in lots of ways. And the types of theology and the types of roles of music and worship they went out of style. And there wasn't a way to use that music in a church function for a pretty long time, and the idea of doing this stuff as concert music didn't really exist. There were works that were sacred works that were written for public spaces that weren't necessarily liturgical. Bach didn't write a whole lot of those. So his keyboard music was around. People who were teaching and working in and around Germany, his keyboard piece of Well-Tempered Clavier was kind of around. But the vocal music, the sacred vocal music, just didn't have, there was no place to slot it. It didn't have a function. His sons and a lot of his students ended up working for courts in and around Berlin, King Frederick's Court and the satellite courts around there. And they were definitely interested in the learnedness of their teacher father's music. And they encountered a lot of other people who were sort of interested in learning the learnedness and collecting. It was kind of a new idea. But it took a while for that music to actually have an audience that wanted to hear it, or to build people who wanted to hear the vocal music. It had to completely run a course of being so obsolete as to become a desired commodity that people would be interested in. And so that's a relatively simple answer to that. But then, how does this stuff come into the concert world? And it's really in and around in Germany. So there's Mendelssohn does the Matthew Passion in Berlin, and that's a very famous story. There were other places, other people who were doing that stuff too. As for the cantatas, that took a bit longer. So that gets you into the 19th century, but it has to be removable from its original sacred liturgical context in this one section of churches in this one little part of Germany to sort of transcend that function to be concert hall music. That's a big leap.
Yeah, no.
And that's where we get the friction of, who's this for now? How does this fit?
interesting because I feel like a lot of instrumentalists wax poetic about the humanity of Bach's music and how it's for everybody because, you know, they don't have to contend with these words. And that's part of the reason why I'm focusing in this particular project on only arias from the church cantatas, not even the passions. Those seem so specific to their function. And so, but, you know, we do create a lot of time for them. I mean, we perform cantatas. I performed cantatas at the Kimmel Center, you know, in a very secular context, and with that giant organ. And, you know, it's something that I, as a singer, have to grapple with in a secular context. You know, how do I come to this music? And, you know, I was teaching a class recently up at Boston Conservatory, an oratorio repertoire, and one of the students raised a hand and was like, I don't believe in these texts. I'm not a Christian. I don't believe in, you know, all of this dogma. How do I get into that? You know, how do I get behind these works when I have to perform them? And, you know, it's an interesting question. And of course, the easy answer is like, it's your job. So you can either say no to the job or you can do your job and kind of get there. But I think it's a much more, there's so much more room for that. And it's so interesting to hear the historical perspective of that also the pieces themselves needed that time in order to kind of be divorced from their function a little bit so that they could just be valued as music.
They become a curiosity.
Yeah.
And they were so different in style from the kinds of popular pieces that were out there for people. They were almost an antidote to the simple, the top 40s of the time. Because music, concert music, operas, things like that they lasted a season. These things become more like ancient music in a way. And that's a really cool facet of history to look at as well. And we have a pretty fast-paced, disposable world at the moment too, and the things that you can find to hold on to that are real, that seem timeless somehow, that seem not of our disposable world, have a particular great value. And Bach's music does seem to keep filling that function. We're not the first generation of people to think that. We might at this moment be much more attuned to how Bach's music is not for everybody and how disenfranchising it can be, and how, like the student you were talking to, like, I don't believe this stuff. How can I go out and sing this? Well, you can be, it's like, well, it's a job, it's a performance. I always say when I'm teaching courses in these pieces in the cantatas or in the passions, like, I would never ask you to believe it. That's not actually what we're here to do. That is what Bach wanted his congregation to do, because what these pieces were designed for was to teach people how to feel about the story that's being told. To put your emotions literally in the place of this reflection on the liturgical events, the biblical events, the teachings of that Sunday. The way we can use those as teaching pieces now, because I think they're always meant to teach, is what they teach now is the things that we need to do better than Bach's culture did. That we need to do better than the past couple hundred years have done. Like, we have an opportunity to use these as teachable pieces, to talk to each other about those things that are so disenfranchising and uncomfortable. And I think if we use them that way, which is actually the spirit in some ways in which they were intended to teach, love thy neighbor as thyself. Go for it. Let's be better. Let's talk our way through this stuff. If you are a person who's deeply uncomfortable performing it, don't. You don't have to. It doesn't. You don't have to do it.
Right.
I think the rub comes in where there's any insistence that one must love Bach, that Bach must be for everybody, that Bach must be studied, that Bach must be venerated. I don't particularly believe any of that, because this is the work of a human being, a flawed human being, who happened to have extraordinary compositional skill and imagination, who had a long-lived legacy, and if you want it, there it is. But we are going to be responsible, to be caring, to make sure this music has a future if we love it. We do have to take the stuff on that is undesirable and do better.
Right.
But you know, do you ever, I mean, there are people who take roles as actors of absolutely terrible people. That doesn't mean you are that person. That's the role you are playing. I mean, musicians play stuff all the time, sing stuff all the time. You don't have to believe it.
No, I mean, I fall in a similar place if I'm confessing my true feelings. I mean, you know, and I think that there's a lot of value in that. And it's interesting, you said something about this music being composed in that spirit, or these pieces being created in that spirit. And I think there is something about his aesthetic and the things that he's asking. I mean, you know, some of these arias, you know, you're being asked to become comfortable with death and, you know, the inevitability of death and the unknownness of what happens after and the beliefs about that. And, you know, I mean, he's asking people to become, to reconcile and to sit with very complicated and very uncomfortable aspects of life and its end. I don't know that he's always looking for an answer. I think that's part of the complexity for his music, and I think that there's value in that in a way.
If we study the cantatas in terms of what the theology that they're meant to, you know, espouse and teach, those are actually of a piece. So Bach does actually have an answer for what death means in his own tradition. So if you want to really crack these pieces open and understand what parts of the message of how to cope are in there, then you do have to sort of start grappling with, or you can start grappling with, well, what were the teachings on this in the time and place? And, you know, death as sleep is a recurring concept, and it's a Lutheran concept, it's not Bach's own. And death is something that's joyous because it's going to be okay in the Christian tradition and the Lutheran way of looking at things. Like, it was not something to be feared. It was something to, you mourn, but then you also find the joy, the bitter and the sweet. There's all these paradoxes. Lutheran theology loves a paradox, and Bach's music is full of them too. And to really understand sometimes the instrumental introductions, which lead into the vocal lines, which actually, you know, the instruments are often playing what the voice is saying, you'll get these contrasting pairs of ideas in the first few words, in the first line of text. And it's also in the ritornello, and then you get into Bach's imagination of how do I create these little micro contrasts. And a lot of times these just get plowed over because we're making a long line, or we're, you know, just in love with our sound, or we don't actually know what the text is. If you're an instrumentalist, sometimes you show up to a gig, you have no idea what the words are that the singer is singing in there in German, and you just got the piece yesterday, and here you go. It's like the words matter profoundly. Mm-hmm. Bach's close attention to the active pieces of text matter profoundly, and they all would originally link into what the teaching was for that day. And if it's about death, then it has a message for us that was specific to his tradition. But I guess that, you know, is Bach's music for everybody? Well, we will all die. So in that sense, here's one way of thinking about it. And here's how one composer from one time in one place in one location wrote about that. Here's how he found musical expression for these complicated and painful things. That in his tradition, that actually it's the sweetness of it, if you've led the life that you've been asked to lead, and, you know, all that kind of stuff. So that's the part, was like, that's the big if. And that's where you kind of go, oh man, if only you could leave that out. He never thought of this music as for everyone. That's the uncomfortable truth, right? I mean, it was for a very specific, he thought of this music for the people around him, for the job that he had, for the function it served.
And yet in that is this weird paradox that to him that probably was everyone. Exactly. I mean, he didn't, I'm about to do the Matthew Passion in Hong Kong, and, you know, it's like, can you imagine him thinking that his music would be performed in Hong Kong by, you know, the Hong Kong Philharmonic? And that's such a foreign and exotic thing. But at the same time, I also find myself wondering, was he even aware that part of the world existed? You know, I mean, well, you know.
Yes, but I can't imagine he ever thought, or he could have even conceived of where his music is now. I don't think it ever crossed his mind. How could it?
Yeah, well, that'd be pretty daunting. It seems like a recipe for, like, writer's block.
Yeah. Well, I think he was I think he was very proud of his skills, but I think as a human, he was actually probably fairly humble. But he had humility in that regard. He knew he was mortal, and we're the ones that made him an immortal. It wasn't him. I think he never would have. How could he possibly have imagined?
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, what was that first Bach cantata that you played?
It was 140.
140. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. And it was an undergraduate, and I was, just playing that very bottom sort of now English horn part. And
Amazing.
it was my very first experience with it, and I will never forget it. It was so special. I mean, in full disclosure, I grew up going to an Episcopal church and hearing all like this music. I already knew the hymn tunes. But I never had experienced how they get worked into a cantata and how you get little snippets of it in every single move. So it was a pretty good one to start out with.
Right.
I think there could be cantatas that would not be as attractive to start off with. I feel really lucky that was my entrance into playing this stuff, and it was probably pretty good now that I look back on it. The people who were involved in it and what we were doing, and
it sounds like it was an excellent experience.
It was very special, and when I teach cantata classes with when I was teaching them at NEC, we always capped the course with a performance of one of the pieces that would fit into our course, because I discovered that most of my students had never done one.
I know.
Wait a minute, we can talk till we're blue in the face with it all semester, but let's actually play one. Let's just do this, experience the sweep of it. They all comment that that's their favorite part of the semester. It's like, mine too, actually. Because that's the payoff, right? And an understanding performance, a performance that really comprehends what the text is and what it's meant to do, and how the drama works and how the education works and how the twists and turns all work, and really being thoughtful about playing the words. That to me that's the dividing line between a performance that's pretty and a performance that's good.
Right. Those are the ones that transform us.
The ones that transfer, the ones that actually communicate. The words were very important to Bach, and they have to be important to the performers.
Yeah. Well, I can't thank you enough.
Thank you.
This week's aria is taken from Cantata 121, Christum wir sollen loben schon, or We Should Already Be Praising Christ. The cantata is a chorale cantata, and the entire thing is based on a hymn tune by Martin Luther, the founder of the Lutheran Church. Bach wrote this in 1724 when he was working in Leipzig, and he composed it for the second day of Christmas. The Bible reading that day tells the story of the shepherds coming to visit Jesus and Mary in the manger right after he's born. They've been told by an angel that the Messiah has come, and they're told where to go, so they flock to the manger and visit Mary and this promised Messiah to adore him. The aria is composed for tenor and oboe d'amore, an instrument that Deborah Nagy spoke about in last week's episode. Check out episode 2 if you haven't already. It's the second movement of the cantata. The translation is, "O you exalted creature of God, do not understand, no, just marvel. God will earn the salvation of the flesh through flesh. How great then is the Creator of all things, and how pitiful and insignificant you are, that through these means are saved from damnation."
Wie